God told my parents to chop half my dick off. It's true. I'm just calling it how it is. And I imagine that it's a similar story with every man on this here live stream today. Welcome to another episode of Hashtag Monday Mischief, where we have a very unique special guest and quite the juicy topic to dig into. So we have Brendan Morata, who is a director of a recent award-winning documentary called American Circumcision. Brendan, welcome, my friend. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I want to quickly share how I came across this documentary. I was having somewhat of a typical Netflix and chill evening with my lady here a few months ago. And we were just always trying to, like, if we feel like we want to watch something, we try and tune into a really interesting documentary. And so we're searching and I see American Circumcision. And instantly I was very intrigued because this concept of circumcision has started to build up some controversy and some conversation around it. I'd say over the past couple of years in particular, it's really picked up momentum there. And so I watched it and it detonated a bomb that was already tick-tocking away in my brain, and did a live right after because I had just so much energy and inspiration around it. And that gathered a lot of momentum. A lot of people came out of the woodworks and started giving their opinions. And one thing led to another, and I got connected with Brendan. And we were like, oh man, we got to hop on and talk about this because this is important. Bringing awareness around this topic. And Kev, you alluded to this before we got onto this. It's akin to like women's suffrage, to gay marriage, to things like that. I would say it's in the same category. So once again, thank you for joining us. And I'm excited to get into some really juicy stuff here.
There is a lot to get into here. I sometimes say that circumcision is the most taboo topic possible. It involves sex, politics, and religion, all in the most personal way possible, on the most intimate part of your body.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I've ever spoken with a group. First off, never on a public forum, as I was sharing. I just started recently researching it last year and getting the ancient and the modern and the medical perspective and all the arguments for and against. And what's funny is, like, in men's circles and intimate circles, it would come up. And a large majority of men, I'd say over 50%, are like, I was circumcised without my consent. And had I known the effects and all the other things, I would not have done it. I would not have consented to that. And then someone always pipes up, whether they're Orthodox Judaism, or whether they're Orthodox Catholic, or whatever, religious ideology, saying, it's about you and God. And this is like to make you clean. And then that's usually a minority. And then there's a bunch of other people that speak up and they're like, well, that prevents disease, right? And like, that's healthy and natural. And I know that's bullshit from my opinion, because I've studied evolutionary theory in depth, evolutionary biology and psychology. And I know that nature does not produce an adaptation unless it has a function and form and purpose. So that argument blows out of the water that, oh, by the way, there's a defect with the men of your species, the males of your species, so go ahead and snip them when they're born because, if I'm God or whatever, or I'm goddess, I didn't mean to do that. That was my bad. So can you clean up my mess for me?
Right. The implication of circumcision is that men are somehow born wrong, in need of an immediate surgical fix of some kind, which, if you think about it, is a very insulting statement to make towards men and the masculine and natural male sexuality, and one that I think if it was made about women's bodies, there'd be a great uproar over. But because it's seen as normal in our culture, because we use a word like circumcision instead of, say, genital cutting, it's not treated the same way.
Well said. I'm curious, Brandon, like, how did you get into this work? Like, how did this documentary, and you being the director, where does that all come from?
So it's funny, that always comes up, and knowing what I know now, I don't know how someone couldn't make this film. I mean, if I told you there was another issue that affected every man in America, every partner of a man, every parent and child, in the most personal way possible, and no one had ever done a large documentary of this scale on it before, you think like, well, that sounds really important. We should talk about that. We should do something about it. But because circumcision is seen as normalized, because it's sort of taboo, because people are able to push it out of their consciousness, that hasn't happened, and people are reluctant to have that conversation. So like most Americans, I circumcision was not something I thought about. It was something that when it would come up, it made me a little uncomfortable. I would think, well, there's nothing I can do about that now. So I think about it. And I was going through a period where I was reading a lot on early life psychology, on how things that happen to you when you're a child affect you later on. And so I'd run across this in that reading and think, well, there's nothing I can do about that. So I'll just out of sight, out of mind. But at the time, I was practicing meditation, and the type of meditation that I practice involves just sitting and being present with whatever's there. I'm not trying to achieve any particular state. It's Zazen, Zen meditation, sitting and staring at a wall. And whatever thoughts come up, you stay with them. You don't fantasize about them. You don't push them away. They're just there. And so during my meditation practice, I had the word circumcision come into my mind, just the word, nothing around it. And I had this cold sensation in the body. And it kind of felt like all my energy drained down to my belt. It was a very uncomfortable, almost numbing feeling. And it happened a couple times during this meditation. And so I thought, well, there must be some part of my consciousness that wants me to look at this. Some part of me thinks this is important or has this within it, and brought that to my awareness as I was sitting in meditation. And I pay attention to what comes up in meditation. So I went home and I started researching. And one of the first things I found was that the procedure is often done without anesthesia. So if you can imagine doing that to a newborn infant, cutting into his genitals without any pain medicine of any kind, it's incredibly intense. Many activists have told me that simply watching the procedure and hearing the scream was what made them want to become an activist, because they thought that is not okay to do to a child. And so when I saw that, I'm reading about how just not being held as a child or not having your needs emotionally met can affect people later in life. What has that got to do? And then as I'm reading, I also discover something called foreskin restoration, where men will take the remaining skin they have and stretch it over time so as to get a covering of that part of the body again, a covering of the head of their penis. And it doesn't bring back all the nerve endings. There are complex structures that are removed you can't get back, but it does increase sensation in some ways. So I started thinking, well, this whole time I've been told by my culture there's nothing you can do about it. Clearly there's something people are doing about it. What else have I been told that isn't true? And that's what led to what one of my interview subjects calls the obsessive epiphany, which is the moment when you realize there is more to an issue than what your culture has told you. And so you end up staying up late, you read every book you can, every website, every podcast. And that was my process for nearly a month. And that research eventually became the film, because film is what I've wanted to do since I was 14. It's what I love doing. It's what I was doing professionally before I discovered this issue. And so I felt like I had a duty to share the information I was learning with others. And film is what I know and love, and was the best way to do that. So that's how the film came to be.
Wow, that is a powerful story, man. Thank you for sharing that. There's just so much there to dig into and dissect.
Well, something just, I can't even imagine watching a newborn be circumcised. And, I had a short stint in vegetarianism and veganism, and I'm sure as many of us may have, watching like the PETA slaughterhouse videos, or like watching them gas a chamber full of pigs, or just like, the horrific ways that factory farming goes down. Like you watch it and you can't even believe it's like reality and not like a gore movie. Can you imagine what it would do to culture if we released, high quality video audio of male infants being like people would go, they would grab their rifles.
It's already out there. You can search it on YouTube. That exists.
Yeah.
Wow.
There is one that we show in the film. The version on Netflix is censored and blurred out, but on other platforms, it's not. And the version that we show is a version where they use painkillers to the best of their ability. So it is the best case scenario for a circumcision. And activists who've seen the version that does not use any kind of pain medicine will say that was a lot less worse than I was expecting. And people who've never seen one before say that was really hard to watch. That was almost too much. I had trouble sitting through that. And so that's the best case scenario. So there is footage of it out there, and many activists have thought, there was a couple years ago, there was a full photographic spread in the Saturday Morning Post that had these like large color photographs of the procedure, and a lot of activists thought that'll do it. That's what's going to change the issue, and it didn't. I think for the same reason that the videos that you mentioned about animal slaughterhouses don't turn everyone vegan. Not everyone sees them, and not everyone is moved to take a collective action based on what they see. So there are lots of people I know who've never seen those videos you mentioned, and there are some who see them and say, yeah, but changing my diet would be really hard, and I don't want to do that. So I think there's something similar here where, and on top of that, there's some people who will just emotionally deny what they see. They'll say, well, he won't remember it, right? It's a newborn infant. He doesn't feel it. He doesn't remember, which all of the data that we have says the opposite. It says that the pain has a lasting and psychological impact and can be felt more intensely in newborn infants than adults because they don't have the same psychological defenses we do. So there's a lot of denial around this issue. And I found that people are even afraid to learn basic facts about it. I mean, just saying that there's a 4-point restraint that they tie infants down to when they do this, and there's a clamp and a 15-minute involved procedure. People are like, oh, no, I heard it was a little snip. It's like, well, I could show you, there's video of it that would prove the opposite. But then, that's a little scary. People don't necessarily want to see that.
Yeah, what's coming up for me, Brennan, is like, this to me is the most extreme example of what happens when you tuck something away and you don't actually look at it. It's like, if I haven't actually been forced or faced something, of course it's not going to be strong in my psyche, and of course it's not going to be strong in my consciousness. And I just have this feeling of like, if this was a part of of sex education, hey, here's what happened to you when you were a child. So if you have a little bit of sexual dysfunction, this might be a possible reason for it, is like just such a huge disservice. And the idea that children don't remember things or infants don't remember things is crazy to me, because that's actually a time when they're most perceptive, that you're having synaptic pruning, right, from 0 to 7. It's like that is a time when everything is imprinting into your being at the highest level. And it blows my mind that there's still anybody who would actually say this is okay. And I'm like, if someone does say this is okay, I would love to just feel into their energy and see how they actually looked at it. And this is the same way that people inflict harm and violence amongst others. It's you make them be an object, right? I can harm someone if it's an other, it's a them, it's a we versus them. Oh, it's the thing on his penis. It's not really, it's just a little object. But it's like, if you actually face reality of like, no, it's not a thing. This is a part of his being. And maybe the intimate part, his sexual being. And I'm jumping out the problems with, masculinity and things like that. Maybe we look at what's happening from birth.
Yeah, there is an attitude that I notice among those who are pro-circumcision that essentially the only relevant information is what can be measured in scientific data, and not all scientific data, just a very specific sliver of scientific data. So they will say that we have these studies that say that it reduces these diseases by this %, and all of that information about men's feelings, about psychology, about infant development, that can be discounted because I don't know how to quantify that. I don't have a chart that I could show you, even though there are people who've studied those things, and you can measure things like cortisol levels rising or a change in behavior that many researchers have interpreted as post-traumatic stress disorder, all sorts of studies that we go through in the film. But to them, that's the emotional and somehow separate from them. And I think that if I was to speculate on that, I would suggest that there's a lot of people who are separated from their own feelings, and so it's very easy for them to ignore the feelings of others.
Yeah, you referenced the part in American circumcision where there's what I would call like a conscious circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
They talk to the doctor, and he's like, seems like a very kind-hearted man who just like, he's doing a job that people want done, but he's doing it to like in the most conscious way, where there's like there's kind of almost a ritual and a ceremony around it. It feels like you're honoring this kind of dishonorable process to the best that you can. And even with that and doing all the things that he did around it to like make the baby comfortable and all those things, it still made me sick to my stomach. And hearing like the screams and the cries, like my girlfriend was brought to tears. And it's such a, yeah, like a dark thing. And just like, oh, even just like recounting it right now, like I can almost bring myself to remember that happening to me, even though like I can't consciously, right? It's just like, oh.
A lot of people have had that reaction to the scene in the film. It's one of the reasons that scene has a title card at the front where it says the full procedure is 20 minutes. We're only going to show you 2 minutes, is because I found when I was doing test screenings that people would just skip that scene because they don't know when they're going in. Am I going to show them 30 minutes? Am I going to show them 2 seconds? And if I was to edit it down to 2 seconds, people would say, oh, well, it's only 2 seconds, but the full procedure is 20 minutes. So I sort of make a deal with the audience and I let them know, like, it's this long, but this is how much I'm going to show you. And when I did screenings across the country, there were usually 2 or 3 people who'd step outside during that scene and they would know, that's too much for me. I can't handle that. I'm going to wait 2 minutes and then go back into the theater. And there were a lot of people who had that reaction, who teared up and cried. So I think that the willingness to look at this requires doing a bit of what you might call shadow work. It requires being willing to look at the things that make us uncomfortable in order to actually confront them and potentially change them.
Yeah, I love that you're taking it to shadow work, Brendan. And, you know, I want to take it to the shadow of the entire Western medical enterprise, which, I mean, I'll couch it in a quick snippet and then we'll go into that. But, you know, there's a way, and I'm a big fan of Alan Watts. You talk about Zazen and sitting meditation. Alan Watts is one of my teachers, even though he was dead before I was born, because I've listened to maybe at this point 10,000 hours of his audio lectures. And, you know, he talks about this a lot, where like the Western medical enterprise is to conquer nature and to defeat death. It's like death is a disease that we're going to treat and we're just going to get rid of it, you know? And that's how a lot of the Western profession is. And I recently, you know, went through the death of my uncle, which was a very powerful experience for my family. And I remember being a child, being at funerals and feeling how like illusory and weird, and how everyone was holding it together by faith in the doctor or by faith in someone who knew what was going on. And I'm just going to trust it. And it's like this infallible feeling about the Western medical profession that I think falls into this category of circumcision. Because like even with my own parents, I remember like the first time I realized I had been circumcised and started asking my mother and father about it. They're like, oh yeah, it's just what you do though. That's what you do. Like the doctor assured us. And it's like, they hadn't even begun to become a question for them. I know a woman, a friend, mother of 2, and her son, she was born, grew up in the Jewish faith. And I think her extended family had something to do with this, but she wouldn't let the doctor circumcise their son. And a rabbi came to her door for a week. Like that's the extent some people go to. And it's like a joint assault. You nailed it. Sex is the taboo. We don't talk about it. And then we got religion and the medical profession doing a twin assault of like, well, you know, your rabbi and your doctor recommend this procedure no matter what. And it's just like, how many parents had no knowledge, were not informed, had good hearts, and put their child's trauma essentially in the hands of these institutions?
It's extremely common. There's actually an entire community of what are known as regret parents, parents who made the decision to circumcise their children and then found out this information later. And doctors on other medical issues are required to give what's known as informed consent. So if you're going to get like surgery on your shoulder, the doctor will tell you everything a reasonable person would want to know about that. Like, here are the risks, here are the benefits, here is what we think might go wrong, these are potential complications, here's what we hope the outcome of the procedure will be. And then you as an adult can make an informed decision on that. With circumcision, they go to the parents and they say, do you want your child circumcised? And that's it. None of the information that we're talking about here is shared, none of the information in my documentary. And there's often a high pressure sales tactic used on the parents right after giving birth. So oftentimes the mother is asked while they're still on drugs from giving birth, if they had some sort of thing like that that was used during birth. So they're a little bit out of it. And one of the court cases that we profile in the film was someone who sued over their circumcision. And during discovery, found out that the mother had given consent for circumcision while she was under the influence of drugs. And he argued, he said, consent given while you're under the influence of drugs isn't valid. So that signature was thrown out during the court case. So there's a lot of things that hospitals and doctors don't do in terms of giving parents information. Prior to the late 1980s, they didn't even ask for consent. They had a general consent form that you would sign when you got in the hospital, and it said the hospital's allowed to do whatever procedures they think is best. It's not specific to circumcision. It's not specific to any vaccine. And it was actually a Jewish couple who wanted to do a ritual circumcision on the 8th day that changed that. So a Jewish couple went in, had a kid, the hospital circumcised them, and they sued and they said, we wanted to circumcise them on the 8th day in a traditional Jewish ritual. Of all things, to make it, that's the reason that you now have to ask for consent in hospitals. And the moment you have to ask for consent, parents have to think about it. They go, I don't know, like, should we do this? Should we not? And now, you know, when I was born, if my parents wanted to learn about this issue, they would talk to the doctor, who would say, well, I charge money for circumcisions. I make money on that, so you should do it. And they would talk to their peers who were from a generation where everyone was circumcised. So what do they know, right? They're just like, well, everyone does this, is what we do. And if they really wanted information, they would have had to go to the library and look up academic journals and hope that those academic journals were written by someone who knew what they were talking about, not just someone who was making money and doing research for other people who are making money. Now if you want information, you're having a kid, what do? First thing you do is you search online. You find all sorts of independent information from people who do not have a financial interest in the procedure, and you can fact check what your doctor says to you. So there's a very different flow of information now. And I think part of the reason that the circumcision rate is dropping is that there's that democratization of information where the four of us simply from our computer can create something that lots of people see. And now the information is not just the authority frame of the doctor and of the medical establishment that is making money on the procedure. It is people being able to talk to each other. Think about it then also, if you were a man and you felt bad about the fact you were circumcised, where would you go? How would you find other people who felt the same way? Maybe you confess to a friend, but if you want to get the word out further, you'd have to start a physical newsletter or buy time on TV or write something in the newspaper. How many people have access to that? Now you go online and there's entire communities of what are known as regret parents or people who are doing foreskin restoration. If you go on the comment section of any article on circumcision, you'll see hundreds of men and women and parents talking about what you guys have mentioned, that they wish it wasn't done to them or they wish they didn't do it to their kids. So now this conversation is happening in part because we have the ability to have it.
I have a question for you, Brennan. What are some of the theories out there or some of the actual data in regards to what does this actually do to a child on a psychological level? How does this show up as disorder? How does this create any dysfunction? What are some of the theories or data out there?
So theories and data are two different things, because it's not like the difficulty with psychological tests is you couldn't split test a population, circumcise half of them, leave half intact, and then give them exactly the same life experience, exactly the same circumstances, environment, genetics, all of those things growing up. But the studies that they have done, one of the ones that is recognized by both people who are against circumcision and for it are the Anand and Hickey pain studies and the Taddeo pain studies, in which one of the things that they did is they proved that infants, yes, do feel pain, and they also studied the lasting effects of that. So in the Taddeo pain studies, they looked at the reaction of children to vaccination. And they found that one group of children being vaccinated responded very dramatically to the pain. So they put a needle in a child for a vaccination. One group reacts hysterically. And they're trying to figure out why this is. Is it breastfeeding? Is it being held? Is it what it was is one group was circumcised. So the circumcised children were reacting very dramatically to this pain, and the researchers attributed that to post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning that the children had a traumatic experience during circumcision and then remembered that pain when they were being vaccinated, and were reacting not just to the pain of being vaccinated, but the memory of being circumcised. Now, one of the difficulties when you talk about this, you say, well, it's been scientifically shown that children remember their circumcision. People will say, well, what are you talking about? I don't remember it. But when we talk about pre-verbal memory, those early life memories, you may not have them in what you might call a narrative memory or a time traveling memory. So if I ask you what you did yesterday, you might sort of time travel in your mind into yesterday and then tell a story about it. And because you're an adult, you're able to do that. Children have not yet developed that ability because they don't necessarily have language at that age. So they would have what you call a somatic memory, meaning that it is a memory stored in the body. This is also the kind of memory that animals have. So if you go to your dog is not going to be able to tell you a story about what it did yesterday, but your dog still somehow remembers when you come home and recognizes you and is happy to see you. And if you were to beat your dog would flinch when you reach for the thing that you beat it with. So it has a memory, it has a change in behavior based on past experience. And if you were to say, well, I can beat my dog because my dog doesn't remember, we would all think that person is a monster. Yet we do the same thing to children under the guise, oh, well, they won't have a conscious narrative memory. When there is a change in behavior, there is a change in the way that the body processes this on a very early primitive level. One of the other things that people talk about is that this affects what's known as the mother-infant bond. So when children are born, they need to bond with their mothers and feel safe in that connection and relationship and trust that the mother can protect and take care of them. This is the earliest relationship between a boy and a woman. Many people talk about how, later life relationships are patterned often on your relationship with your mother. So to have violence, not just violence, but sexual violence inserted into that has to have a lasting effect of some kind. Now, how much that affects and how it affects each person is going to be different for each person, right? So one person may be affected by that differently and one person may not. And if you experience a significant trauma early in life and then you're taken home into a happy family in which all of your other experiences are happy, maybe that trauma doesn't affect you the same way as someone who is then brought into a home where they don't have that safety. So that's where it gets hard to measure later on in life, but I can't help but think that there is some effect. It would be absurd based on everything else that we know about early life memories and how early life experiences affect you later on to suggest that there's no impact, which is what many in the medical establishment will do. Never mind that there are studies that show that there's some. They'll say, well, that shows that they remember it later when they're being vaccinated, but it doesn't prove that it affects you when you're an adult, right? Even though just because you can't do the same one-to-one study with that doesn't mean that that isn't continuing. If anything, there would have to be evidence presented to show that that memory is forgotten in some way, which no one has done a study to prove.
Man, I love the parallels you're making with the dog, and just this whole conversation you are quite knowledgeable, my friend, and I appreciate and acknowledge you. And as you're saying that last part, I was thinking of the older gentleman who represents kind of the other side of this argument, I guess you could say, who's I think like the founder or something of the Pediatrics Society.
So if you're talking about Edgar Schoen, he was the chair of a policy statement for the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Gotcha, yeah. And he does essentially exactly what you're saying, just sort of poo-poos on everything else and just hangs his hat on it being like a public health issue. That is like the reason for it, and everything else be damned. Nothing else matters because it is a serious public health issue. And it's like any questions that are asked of him, he just goes back to that. And it's like, it's very interesting to watch and very eye-opening. And one thing that I wanted to talk about to kind of shift gears a little bit that we haven't gotten into is the cultural norm or lack thereof for somebody who is uncircumcised. And I want to maybe segue into this conversation by sharing a quick story of something I experienced. So one of my best friends from high school, it got out, I think our sophomore or junior year of high school, that he was uncircumcised. And it like turned into this whole ordeal where he was so ashamed. There was like so much drama and trauma around it that he actually, as a 16, 17-year-old young man, got circumcised at that age. And it was like, I'm imagining, 15 years later, like, and I think it's still there on some level. It's maybe not quite as prevalent, but I think still in the United States, certainly it's like very much still there. And I'm like curious around this shift and this evolution as this awareness picks up, like when that is going to follow suit. And I'm curious your thoughts on that.
So look at even the language of that, uncircumcised. It implies that circumcision is the norm. You wouldn't say a woman is unmastectomied or unclitorectomized. You're a lot of things. You would say that she's normal, whole, natural, intact. And yet with men in our language, we imply that circumcision is a norm. So many who are involved in the issue will refer to men as intact when they still have their foreskin. They'll say they're natural or they're whole. And as a culture, we sort of frame that as the weird thing and circumcision as the norm. And I think at the time that your friend was growing up, that was a lot less common. Now the circumcision rate is around 50%. And so it's not as big a deal. It's not like there's the one guy who's different. It's that half the people are one way and half are another. And in some places, it's very different rates. So for example, the Midwest still has a high circumcision rate, but California is incredibly low. And there's also a different attitude around the body shaming that you're talking about. So at the time, one of the arguments I've heard for circumcision is, well, he'll feel different if you don't do it. And I think this argument usually comes from people who grew up in a time where the circumcision rate was 90%, and that was their experience, that there was one person who felt different. Now, if you were to body shame someone in that way, we might take the opposite approach and say, you shouldn't body shame someone. You shouldn't say that the natural body is somehow wrong. And if your daughter was being teased because her breasts were too big, you wouldn't say, well, you better get breast reduction surgery to fit in. They would say, like, no, your body is the way that your body is. You should accept it. You should be proud of it. You shouldn't let someone bully you into surgically altering your body. Yet when it comes to men in this part of the body, that frame is still accepted. So I think there has to be a shift in consciousness there where the values that we have accepted around not body shaming, around the idea that the natural body is okay and fine, that your body doesn't have to conform to a social standard that doesn't serve you. Those ideas need to catch up to this issue.
Yeah, this is a huge paradigm shift that goes back all the way to ancient times, where the body is revered as sacred and a temple for the spirit, whatever the name you give the spirit, right? And I think to bring back the Western medicine focus, and I'm not against Western medicine. Like, I've broken bones and had to have surgery that had healed me. So I'm actually grateful for the scientific advances of Western medicine for trauma. Like, if my body gets pulled apart in an accident, I'm going to go to the best Western doctor to put it together. But for just about anything else, I found a lot more healing in what we might name more Eastern modalities: yoga, meditation, traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda.
So the frame.
Go ahead.
The frame you're talking about in Western medicine is this sort of frame that the body is broken and in need of fixing, that it naturally is falling apart, and doctors are kind of like a car mechanic that has to go in there and repair it every now and then. As opposed to the frame that you see in a lot of traditional medicine, that the body is naturally self-healing, and when nourished and fed properly, will mostly take care of itself. So if you experience trauma and you need your body fixed, Western medicine is great because they know how to fix it. If you have a natural process that needs to happen in your body, Western medicine will sometimes throw a fix in there that disrupts that process. And this is an example of that. A child who comes out of the womb is not born broken in need of fixing. It's not like male sexuality is somehow inherently wrong and has to have part of it amputated. And the frame that you need to cut parts of the body off for health reasons is sort of, I jokingly refer to it as the idea that your penis is trying to kill you. That if you leave your penis fully attached to you, eventually it's going to get you with one of those diseases, and you just got to kill it first. When you frame it like that, it's really absurd, right? But yet that is the frame. Well, if you leave it on there, you're going to get these diseases and these things will happen. And we don't frame any other part of the body that way. We don't say, well, what are the risks and benefits of cutting off my ear? Like, would I get less ear infections if I cut my ear off? With that, you'd say, well, that part has a normal function and thing that it does. And if you remove it, you lose that function. And more than that, you have the right to your ear. So someone should not be able to decide what body parts you keep. Yet this is the one body part that is framed differently in Western medicine, I think largely for cultural reasons. So when you look at why people make the decision, it's not like parents are reading a lot of academic journals on HIV transmission rates and urinary tract infections and things like that. They're making the decision largely based on, well, that's what we do. That's what our parents did. That's what our culture says we should do. That's what seems normal to us. It's not really a intellectual, scientifically made decision. And I think that part of the challenge of changing this issue is that there isn't one thing causing it. If it was just religion, well, you could work on that and change it. If it was just culture, you could change that. If it was just medicine, you could change that. If it was just men's ideas about masculinity, you could work on that. If it was just the way that women treat men, you could work on that. But it's all of those things coming together. And when you talk to someone about this issue, they'll sort of flip between them. They'll say, well, it's a religious thing. You'll say, well, we have other religious practices that we don't do and we don't consider okay. It's not okay for Islamic people to cut little girls' genitals. Why would it be okay for Jewish people or people who practice male circumcision to do that? And they'll say, well, there's all these health benefits. And it's like, hold on, you said it was a religious thing a second ago. Now you're implying it's a medical thing. How did we switch topics here? And then you'll talk about dispel the medical medicine. They'll say, well, yeah, but it's my culture. Hold on. We jumped again, right? And so it's sort of an amorphous issue in that people will shift it to whatever allows them not to do the shadow work, not to actually feel their feelings, not to actually explore what's there going on with it.
Ooh, you speaking the language, brother. Something that you touched on there that I want to dive into a little bit is, what is the reason for the foreskin? Like, why do we naturally have it? What purpose does it serve?
So every mammal has a foreskin. The foreskin protects the head of the penis. It has the highest density of nerve endings on a man's body. And if you think about and it performs a gliding sensation during sex. So if you think about the places where you have a lot of nerves on your body, the most nerves are on the ridged band of the foreskin. It's the lips around it. And every opening of the body has a lot of nerve endings. So your lips and your ass and a woman's opening, all those things, lots of nerve endings. And it's important because obviously if you want to know what is going in and out of the body. And so that's the highest nerve laden part of a man's body. And during sex, the foreskin glides over the head of the penis. And that gliding sensation means that the head of the penis and the foreskin are rubbing against each other. So the man is being stimulated on this skin, on the skin on the inside of his foreskin, and on the head of his penis. So it's a lot of sensation, and it allows the man to glide in and out of himself during sex. It also protects the head of the penis and prevents it from drying out and becoming what's known as keratinized. So keratinization is when there is a thick layer of keratin that builds up on the skin. You've probably had the experience of, if you work with your hands a lot, you get calluses on them. Your elbow is more rougher skin than maybe the rest of your arm because it's being rubbed against something. And when you remove the covering of the head of the penis, when you remove the foreskin, then that's rubbing against whatever clothes you have and developing this sort of thick layer of protection on it. Because the head of the penis is meant to be mucosal, kind of like the inside of your mouth. It's meant to be wet and slippery and have natural lubrication. If you think about it in the wild, you wouldn't go to CVS to buy synthetic lubricant for sex. Your body would be naturally lubricating, the same way that women's bodies are naturally lubricating. So when the foreskin is there, that natural lubrication is there as well. And when you remove it, the head of the penis becomes rough. It develops this layer that reduces the sensitivity of the head of the penis because you've got this thick layer of protection on it, the same way that your hands are not as sensitive and you've got thick calluses on them. And over time, that reduces sensation more and more. So there's a lot of men who talk about losing sensation as they get older, and that I think is increased by the fact that the head of their penis is rubbing against whatever they're wearing, and slowly building up more and more protection and keratin. And men who have done foreskin restoration, and you can't get the complex nerve endings of the ridge band back or the complex nerve endings of the inside of the foreskin, but you can get that covering again. And they report that their glands becomes mucosal again. If you wanted to experience this, you could run a personal experiment where you just wear a condom for 3 weeks straight and have a synthetic covering there and see the difference. And there's one activist I know who is Jewish who tried that, just thinking like, I'm going to show these people that they're wrong. And then after he removed the covering, he's like, wow, this is different. This is a very different sensation. And so there are ways that you can sort of test this on yourself, do what you might call an N=1 study on your own sensitivity. But the foreskin itself, it protects the head of the penis. It creates a gliding sensation. It has the highest density of nerve endings. And so to remove that changes a lot of sensation and changes a lot during sexuality.
Brennan, I actually want to share some. Yeah, go ahead. Please finish.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna share something with you, man. It's coming up really strong in my body and my heart right now, and I guess I'll share with everybody else watching. I'm feeling this level of anger, and I'm actually gonna call it rage. I've thought about this a lot, but I've never gone this deep into it before, and it's like, I feel like let down by this system, let down by, in some ways, my parents. And it's like, this to me is such an example of like why it's so important to me to question everything, to look at everything, to be objective, to step outside of my culture norm and really ask check in with my body, my heart. Is this actually what I want to do to my child? And I'm wondering if you cross a lot of parents who feel a tremendous amount of guilt or shame when they realize what they have maybe put their child through. Is it something you experience a lot with people?
There's a lot of the feelings you describe, both from men who have experienced circumcision and from parents who regret the decision to circumcise. So there is a lot of sadness, there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of anger. These feelings, I think, are normal if you experience the feeling that you've been violated or that you've been let down by someone or that someone did something to you that hurt you without your consent. And part of the challenge that we have around this issue is that the wider culture does not understand those feelings, does not know how to hold space for those feelings, and will often invalidate those feelings because in order to accept those feelings that someone might be dissatisfied with circumcision, they have to question circumcision. So if you're not willing to look at that, then you have to invalidate those feelings and dismiss the men and the parents and the partners of men who are coming forward and talking about this. So one of the things that I talk about whenever I speak to an audience that's aware of this issue is healing work. I think healing work is really important, and especially around this issue. And part of the challenge here is there's not a lot of healers who are aware of this issue. There's a lot of men who will go to their therapist and they'll say, I'm feeling grief around circumcision. And their therapist will say, well, what do you mean? Circumcision's normal. And it's like, you can't help me with this now. If you're going to invalidate my feelings, I don't trust you to hold space for them and heal them. So there's a challenge here in that there's a lot of men who are becoming aware of this. And there's already huge challenges around men seeking healing work in general. But there's especially challenges around this because the wider culture isn't aware of it. So one of the things I'm trying to do is encourage more healers to take that on. And I'm trying to develop some tools that will help connect men and people who can do that healing work, but it's still in development now. There's a few people doing it. There's there's some of the people who interview in the film. One of them is a psychologist who works with a lot of men around this. There are people doing a lot of healing modalities like you guys might be familiar with, things that are more somatic work, things that are able to get at those early life memories, but there's a need for more.
Well, I know, Brendan, from you looking at your page, you've done some bioenergetics and Osho meditations, yes?
Yes, this is true.
Yeah. that kind of work, our audience super familiar with it. We've been going deep into it for years now. That kind of work for me, maybe the only method that works for me personally and that I use with clients to access this, because just talking about it, especially because of its taboo nature, and, you know, going to your partner, spouse, or going to your family and being like, hey, I'm having this like trauma release around circumcision. You know, they, like you said, they think you're crazy. And it goes the other way where it actually becomes a point of contention. It's like, well, don't make me wrong as your parent for doing it. Everyone was doing it. Like, don't make me wrong. And, you know, and the grief and the rage have nowhere to go. So I think the somatic work and the bioenergetic work is like, it's just for you. And it's like, you can regress and move that massive energy so you can, you know, trigger that psychological healing for yourself.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying there. And, you know, one of the challenges is that for parents who aren't willing to look at this issue yet, someone's reality on this could be invalidating to their feelings and reality. And in general, talk therapy does not work as well with men. So there's a book by Tom Golden about how men heal differently called Swallowing the Snake, in which he talks about the idea of creating a sacred space of some kind as a container. Because one of the things that I think a lot of men fear, that when they go into this, that their feelings are going to be never ending, and that they're going to interrupt the other things they have in their life. So that they're going to be at their work, or they're going to be in a professional setting and break down and have these feelings come through. And so creating a container and space like that is really good. And men tend to not do as well with talk therapy in general, especially when you talk about early life issues. The things that I have found and the things that other people I've talked to have found is that somatic work that gets you in the body, work that bypasses the narrative mind is really good. And trance-based work, things that put you in a hypnotic state of some kind that also bypass the narrative mind and get to what you might call the deep mind. So that is what I have found in my own personal life to be really good. And that's what a lot of men who've done healing work on this have found really helpful. And there's a billion methodologies in there, and we could do a whole podcast just on those, but I'll leave it at that.
Man, I'm just like so blown away by this interview, Brennan. And I'm just so incredibly grateful to be opening to shining the light on what is still very much in the shadows, and still very much still, if 50% of the population is still doing this, it's a very, very active part of our culture. And even more so than that, the repercussions from those of us who grew up in the era. Me and my brother grew up in the Midwest. You know, Kev grew up in Texas, and it's like this was the cultural norm. So you have a whole generation of men who begun the first waking, you know, weeks or months of their life experiencing sexual trauma. And if I just want to say to anybody out there who's watching this, if this is like bringing up stuff in you, it's igniting some kind of fire, don't just shove it down and just, you know, try to like bury it and repress it even more. That's doing the same thing that, you know, it's burying it into the shadow. Talk to somebody about it. Find somebody you trust. You could send me a message if you want. Like, this kinds of conversations, like, let's bring this shit out into the light and honor that, yeah, you know what? It's fucked up. It is fucked up. There's no other way around it. And it's okay to be pissed off about this. And your feelings damn sure aren't invalid. And that's the last thing I want to say about that is that anytime somebody tells you that what you're feeling is wrong, be very suspicious of that person, because it's your feelings and you are allowed to feel how the fuck you want to feel, man. And that's all there is to it. So yeah, just thank you so much, man. I'm feeling so grateful for you right now, brother.
Whew. Appreciate it.
A powerful conversation indeed. And there's lots of comments of flaring. I don't know if you guys have glanced on it, but
I have not looked at them yet.
Yeah, as to be expected. There's some shots fired.
Yeah. Do you want to look at any of the questions, Jordan or Kev? You got anything?
Well, it's funny. It's funny you brought up vaccines too, Brendan, because we've been more of a, what I would name, you know, a conscious boy brand tricksters and entertainers. I really want to own the entertainer role that we provide. Although there's deep work, you know, we bring that with the brand and have in the past. And one fateful day, I slapped a vaccination meme on the page, and it started a mass unfollowing and a firestorm because it was, and you could substitute this for circumcision. It was a pretty lethal one. It was like Abraham and Isaac on the mountain, right? From the Old Testament story. And God's coming down and he's like, hey, by the way, I totally fucked up when I made the immune system. So I'm going to totally need you to vaccinate your baby. All right, thanks. It's like, just like God being like, hey, I really fucked up when I made the penis. Did you finish the job for me real quick? And it's like,
Right.
people lost it, like posting study after study after rant after rant. And yes, there is a space that I want to hold, and I can only speak for myself, of radical informing. So I want to become radically informed about what is happening to my body based on evidence I've found. You can guess where I land on these issues. But for anyone out there that's watching this interview and is feeling a lot, if you have a son, if you are a man, if you want to have a son, radically inform yourself. That's the invitation. Because anything less than that, I just think is a travesty. And that goes for anything, not just circumcision, but anything to do with your body and your mind and your spirit. Like, inform yourself. Don't just take someone's word for it, to your point, Ryan.
Amen, Kevsky. And the way to get informed is, man, if you haven't checked out this documentary yet, it'll open your eyes. It is lots of emotions that are worked through. It is well worth, I think it's the better part of 2 hours investment. And man, I was on the edge of my seat the whole time, just experiencing the full spectrum of emotions. Man, I want to once again honor you, Brendan, for doing this work. Like, such a great documentary, such a potent topic right now. Is there anything else you want to share before we start to sign off here?
If you want to see the film, it is on circumcisionmovie.com, and I am certain I'll be doing more stuff, not just around this issue, but in filmmaking in general. So you can find me at BD Murata on all social media platforms. And my goal with the film is that it gives you the information you need to explore your own feelings. So I fully agree with the idea of being radically informed, and I hope that my film can serve that for some of you.
Thank you.
Is it still featured on Netflix right now, Brendan, as well?
Yep, it is up there.
So no matter where you're coming from, folks, like, you've heard it here, you know what's up. We'll have a link in the comments, but go watch the film if you have a Netflix account, or it's on the website as well.
Yep.
This is important. Like, I want to hold the vision of an earth where no man is circumcised unless he chooses it himself. And no woman is circumcised either. Or whatever the clitorectomy, like, no woman is going through that as well unless they choose it. That's it. Aho.
Yeah. And you brought up a great point too, Kevsky. There's other parts of the world where clitoral mutilation is happening and there's absolute outrage about it. Everybody's like, this is an absolute atrocious act. And you know what? I'm okay with having the same amount of outrage for what's happening right now here with men. And us being the Misfits, we work a lot with men. We've done a lot of men's groups, and we will continue to do that. And I just want to hold that space for every man watching this, every parent. Like, we're in this together. Like, I feel it's the same way that you might be feeling right now. And like, dude, let's keep talking about this. Let's support each other, and let's move through this so that we can look back as we're, old grandpas sitting around, talking about, man, you remember back in my day, son, we used to chop off the penises. And it'd be like, what, Grandpa? Grandpa's crazy. It's like, oh, Grandpa's actually right. They used to chop penises off back then. That's the story I want to live, but it's no longer done.
No more chopping of the dicks, please.
Yeah.
Let's keep them intact. And I'll underscore one more thing. Let's change our language around this. I love that you called me up on that, Brendan. It's not circumcised and uncircumcised. It's circumcised or intact. And that's something that my girlfriend's been checking me on, and you caught me on it, but intact. Awesome. All right. Well, appreciate you guys. Thank you, everybody, for joining on another episode of Monday Mischief. It was a powerful one. Share it, like it, comment, tag someone that you think will get some value out of this, and we'll see you next time.
Love y'all. Peace.